Good morning and welcome to the Japan Society's regular webinar on current affairs and business. As you know, I'm Bill Emmott and I have the honor and pleasure of chairing the Japan Society. This week our topic is trade and business. Once these issues might have seemed technical or quite specialized, but Brexit has made them highly political as well as quite personal. We are gathered today to review the impact of the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement during its first month, which means the first 4 to 5 weeks of the UK's real departure from the European Union and its single market for goods, 4.5 years on from the referendum. The fact that agreement on the TCA was finally reached on December 24th in time to come into effect just a week later when we entered the new year was a relief, since it avoided the introduction of tariffs on both sides, much political recrimination, and of course great uncertainty for business. But as we've seen, given that incredibly short notice, the relief at the double negative, that there was no deal, has been quickly replaced by all sorts of frictions and issues, often things that were buried deep in the fine print, but also unfortunately many issues that really were highly predictable. Over the past couple of days alone, we have seen particular sound and fury over our old friend, the Irish Sea border and the Northern Ireland Protocol, with the UK and EU now opening talks about revising the terms of the agreement potentially, and with unfortunate threats being received by port workers at Belfast and Larne, thought to be from unionist paramilitary or criminal groups. From my vantage point, overlooking the Irish Sea in South Dublin, I have seen that there's been a big shift to sending trucks on boats direct from Dublin and Rosslare to ports in France and the Netherlands, rather than sending them across to the UK and its so-called land bridge to Europe. Freight traffic in and out of Rosslare has reportedly increased 5-fold in just 5 weeks. So that's a small local example of the fact that all sorts of adjustments and adaptations are going on. How much of what we've seen can be called teething troubles and how much is permanent? How is business, small or large, British or Japanese, reacting and adapting? How is this affecting consumers? To address those questions, I'm delighted to welcome 2 very expert speakers, respectively on trade and on Japanese business. Our trade expert is David Henig, Director of the UK Trade Policy Project at the European Centre for Political Economy, based in London himself. And our Japanese business expert is our fellow Japan Society member and board director, Pernille Rudlin, who in her 2 consultancy roles at Japan Intercultural Consulting and her own Rudlin Consulting, works with many Japanese firms and firms doing business with Japan, and who has been monitoring their evolving plans and adaptations to Brexit. As usual, we will begin with 10 minutes of remarks from each of our speakers, followed by a discussion and your questions. Please, as always, write your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom and feel free to vote for other people's questions so as to bring them closer to my attention. Any attendees with practical examples of your own on the new trading regime should certainly feel free to share them with us through that same method. Today, I'm going to open with the broad trade view from David Henig before homing in on the Japanese response from Pernille. Welcome to the Japan Society, David, and over to you.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for the invite. I will do my best in 10 minutes. There seems to be so much going on at the moment with regard to UK trade. I'm going to make 5 points, and I'll make them in turn and then remind you what they are at the end. And the first point I'm going to make is that this is a question I keep being asked. Has anything surprised you about the way Brexit has gone? And I think the biggest surprise is when I answer and say, no, it has been almost exactly as was predicted, I'm afraid. What we were dealing with was the largest one-day change in trade relations in modern history. Modern trade relations, particularly in the EU single market, particularly with a sophisticated, integrated chains of production, of travel, of goods, of people, suddenly moved from that permissive regime where you can assume everything was possible to a prescriptive regime where you have to check what is allowed and what is not. There are many inspections, where moving a product goes from maybe a 2-step process to a 30-step process. That is inevitably going to have an impact, particularly if the trade relationship in question is worth nearly £2 billion a day. We've not actually seen anything like this in trade policy history. From a trade policy practitioner point of view, this is very exciting. It is not so exciting if you are a business struggling with it. But we are seeing disruption. Now, the disruption we're seeing can sometimes take on odd forms. There was less traffic between the UK and the EU. I think the move of Irish lorries to go direct to France on new ferry routes is probably predictable. We're seeing more empty lorries going from Britain into France. Food and drink was the first majorly affected sector, and that is because those areas have the most rules and the most inspections. Fish and seafood in particular is always a tricky issue in trade. We knew that rules of origin in a trade agreement really don't support the UK as a European hub, importing from around Europe, exporting to around Europe, importing globally. And that's an inevitable consequence of not being in a single market or customs union. There have been VAT problems. Few people, in fact, understand VAT. We have seen the border down the Irish Sea that was officially denied, but was clearly a part of the trade scenario as a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, some of this is teething troubles. There are a lot of new forms to be filled in by exporters who haven't previously done that. There is the shortage of customs agents. There are the transport routes that simply are no longer suitable for the kind of trade that we're now doing. Some of it, we haven't even got to the teething troubles yet, because in terms of services, goods are more noticeable, but in terms of services, like the example of the musicians who will no longer be able to tour the EU so easily, we will have to wait until post-COVID. But inevitably, there is an element of adjustment to the new reality, a short-term adjustment. We will get better. The delays will, in general, get less, but the unpredictability will remain. The new processes will remain. The fact that this is no longer seamless trade, that will remain. So we have a changed scenario, and this brings me on to point number 2. We can expect long-term economic adjustment as a result of the changed scenario. The UK economy will adjust as a result of the new barriers. That will happen in various ways. We talked already about the UK no longer being a European hub. That will affect distribution. I think it will affect manufacturing. I think it will affect particularly smaller manufacturers and their role within the European supply chains. Smaller companies generally find it harder to go through export procedures. They can't employ the kind of people that larger companies can do. Some, I think, manufacturing capability will probably be lost. And I think this will actually hit both EU and global exports and imports from the UK, because when we're no longer a European hub, we'll be doing less trade globally that then goes on to Europe. So we'll probably see an absolute decline, certainly caused by this, in goods trade to the UK because of this the new trade relationship. Now, services are less clear. There are some services which will be less affected, particularly services provided remotely. And you may find in this adjustment that there is a move from, say, small manufacturing as part of European supply chains to services provided remotely. It may be the case that financial services are not as affected as many people suggest, because they're able to operate subsidiaries or various ways of structuring their business. Larger companies can probably navigate the new procedures more easily. And so we see Nissan, and I'll come back to Nissan, continuing their operations in Sunderland. And I think it's important to say that the average forecast for the loss to the UK of leaving the EU with just a free trade agreement of about 4 or 5%, that seems to be in line with what we're seeing. That means, though, that remember, that's a lot of business and trade that will not be affected. 5% is a big number, bigger than we would ever normally get from a trade deal. But still, many parts of the economy will be unaffected. There will be winners as well as losers. There will be substitution of imports for production in the UK, for example. So it doesn't all just go one way. Moving on to the politics, and a third point here, that the UK has quite a weak negotiating hand and is not playing it very well. The UK government hasn't really shown a sign of having a particularly deep understanding of modern trade, modern supply chains, the importance of non-tariff barriers, the importance of services. We were low on ambition in the EU deal in those areas, and as a result, we got a low ambition deal. We've been low in ambition in global talks as well, and the same looks like it will probably happen. The focus on tariff reduction really doesn't play on what the main problems are in modern trade, which are about diverging regulations, about checks. Now, maybe we will learn that as we're now seeing more checks applying to UK goods, making UK exports uncompetitive. There is this idea that we're a beacon of free trade, but it's not really backed up by what has happened with regard to the EU, and a feeling that we will cut deals that are somewhat less than ideal because we want to be seen to be making deals. So it's not a great negotiating hand. And that brings me on to my fourth point, which is that stakeholders have had quite limited influence on UK government actions, but Nissan, in the Japanese angle, has emerged as what might be seen as a national champion in the UK. So the government was quite closed on EU negotiations. For example, businesses pushing for regulatory alignment were rebuffed. But it seems to me that one of the main reasons for going with a deal rather than no deal was because Nissan said that their plant in Sunderland would not be sustainable in the event of no deal. Similarly, one of the rare areas in which the UK government obtained a little bit more than normal in the trade deals was rules of origin around electric vehicles. It's not a great deal for that, but it is slightly better. And there seems to be a Nissan influence there. So if I was thinking from the point of view of other companies in the UK, I might be asking, how do we become a kind of national champion of the likes of Nissan in order to influence future government trade policy? Finally, the final point is that I think that more distant relations with the EU are here to stay, but we will seek to improve them after some interval. So I think that for the moment, we see a move from the UK government to what is now called the Indo-Pacific region. We see the potential to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, potential new bilateral deals with Australia and New Zealand. Clearly, there's a desire to have a US trade deal as well, but that seems to be likely to be delayed due to President Biden not really wanting new trade deals. The problem with all of these is there's no obvious economic uplift from them. Tariffs and barriers to trade with most of the countries involved are quite low already. We already have bilateral deals. And so I think that what is likely to happen is that we do these deals, but after a while we realize that the economic gains are not coming and we are losing from not having better relations with the EU. And whilst I don't think we will be rejoining the single market or the EU anytime soon, I think after some time we will seek to recalibrate the EU relationship and seek to remove some of the barriers that have now come into place, but not, I'm afraid, anytime in the coming weeks and months. And therefore, I think businesses will have to get used to these new barriers. So in conclusion, the change has come. Now comes the adjustment, and as I say, the 5 points. It's been pretty predictable so far. There will be a long-term economic adjustment. We have a relatively weak negotiating hand. Stakeholders need to think about how they can best influence the government, and the UK government will take some time before returning in a serious way to improving UK-EU trade relations. Look forward to further discussion. Bill.
Thank you very much, David. That was very, very comprehensive, and thank you for all those 5 points. And I particularly was interested in that sense of the national champion role that Nissan has succeeded in playing, and how other companies can follow that example. We might discuss that further shortly, and then about how also the point you make about how recalibrating to improve is going to be a task, at least of the medium term, even if not of the immediate term. Now, Pernille, over to you. You are a close student and researcher on Japanese companies and their preparations as well as their adaptations. What are you seeing?
Okay, thank you, Bill. So I'd like to kick off my remarks by outlining my big theory of Brexit, which first came to me about 6 years ago at a lunch where Dennis McShane, the former Minister for Europe, predicted that the referendum coming the next year would result in a vote to leave the EU. And I looked at the assembled Japanese business people sitting around me and tried to think through the implications for them and for me, because they represented my main client base. And so my big theory of Brexit, which I think has pretty much panned out as I thought, is that basically Brexit has accelerated trends that were already there. They have given Japanese companies impetus to do things which they were kind of thinking of doing anyway, or knew they ought to do. I'm looking at Honda here particularly. And as many people on this call know, Japanese companies are extremely risk averse, very keen on long-term planning. So basically they had been preparing for a hard Brexit for the past 5 or 6 years now. So tracking those trends over the past 6 years as I have, the sort of headline is that overall, the number of Japanese companies in the UK has started to decline, as has the number of UK-based people employed by Japanese companies in the UK. And net foreign direct investment flows from Japan into the UK have decreased clearly year on year recently, with some actual disinvestment in certain sectors of the UK. But this is from a very high base. The UK is still the biggest host of Japanese nationals in Europe. It still has the biggest stock of Japanese foreign direct investment in Europe. And as far as I can tell, very few Japanese companies are actually fully leaving the UK. And in fact, I doubt that they ever will. So to go sector by sector, so kicking off with manufacturing. So of the 1,000 or so Japanese companies that are in the UK, estimates vary, it depends what you count as a company. But I reckon around 20% of those 1,000 or so are in manufacturing, as in they actually have manufacturing operations here in the UK. And those 20% employ about a third of the 185,000 people who work for Japanese companies here. So that's one reason why manufacturers get all the attention. They are relatively more labour intensive. And also, obviously, as David pointed out, it's manufacturing and it's supply chains that are most obviously affected by trade deals, because trade deals rarely have much about services in them. And within that, automotive is particularly labour intensive, which is again why it gets so much attention. And I think the numbers employed in the UK automotive sector have pretty much been declining year on year since 2016. Yes, you could argue that this is a sort of industry issue around diesel and so on, but my research into the rest of Europe, particularly Germany and Eastern Europe, show that actually employment in the automotive production sector has been increasing, and Japanese companies in the rest of Europe in the automotive production sector have been increasing as well. So I think really, sorry, we do have to say, despite what Honda said, that this is a Brexit impact. So as I said, you know, it pushes people to doing things what they're doing anyway. Honda had already been struggling, as is known, with Swindon, trying to get it up to capacity, make it profitable. And, you know, has of course announced that it's going to close this year. And so, of course, a lot of its supply chain in the UK are also going to shut down this year, which means that in the past month, when there were issues, Honda, I think, suspended production a little bit more than Nissan or Toyota have. And of course, this was as much to do with COVID, supply chain issues and global chip shortages as it was to do with Brexit. Toyota apparently did suffer some delays right at the beginning on January the 1st or so, but has otherwise been quite silent. I would characterize it as the dog that is not barking at the moment. There was a small kind of woof last week. The Japanese Nikkei reported that Toyota is said to be, and I quote, reconsidering their optimal production supply chain strategy, and there is no guarantee the next models will continue to be made in the UK. So sort of nicely hedged there. But and as Dave pointed out, I mean, famously Nissan said, yes, we like the deal. We're going to start producing our new Leaf. The old Leaf didn't have a very big range. The new Leaf does, and it needs new batteries for that. And the plant that made batteries that Nissan used to own, but is now owned by a Chinese company, is right next door in Sunderland. So presumably some investments coming that way to produce those new batteries as well. I don't think, despite what the Financial Times said, that this is a reason for saying this secures the future of Sunderland. Nissan is still very volatile. The trial of Carlos Ghosn's sort of colleague is still ongoing, and all sorts of horrible revelations are coming out of that. I think Nissan is extremely faction-ridden, as is well known. Any leaks to people like the Financial Times come from particular factions, and there is undoubtedly a faction at Nissan that likes Sunderland, doesn't like Renault, and this is a kind of positioning on their part to say, you know, we're going to carry on with Sunderland regardless. Renault is meant to have the lead in the alliance for marketing and so on in Europe, and Renault has a best-selling electric vehicle, the Zoe, which it makes in France. So, yeah. I think that fight is still being fought, basically. And as everyone has said, including a very good article in today's Financial Times, actually, now, of course, we have to rethink about electric vehicles and the batteries. People want to manufacture near batteries. Battery manufacturers want to manufacture near car production. The Koreans and the Chinese are already well ahead here. China is, one of the Chinese big battery companies is about to start production in Germany, I believe, within this year. So the race is on. Other manufacturing, infrastructure, energy, that kind of thing. Actually, it's good news over the past few years. Japanese employment has expanded. However, it all went completely flat in 2020, but presumably that's partly to do with COVID. But the point about the non-automotive manufacturing in the UK is that it's largely driven by acquisitions. Japanese companies acquiring what they see as good producers here in the UK. And the acquisitions recently have actually been acquisitions acquiring acquisitions, particularly consolidating their supply chain, buying up installation companies, that kind of thing. There have been very few such acquisitions in 2020, but again, it's very difficult to do due diligence right now, so not surprising perhaps. The main organic growth driver is Hitachi Rail. And I think we really need to keep an eye on Hitachi Rail as well. Hitachi, of course, also, one thing that has happened over this past month is they have finally announced that they really are going to shut down the Horizon nuclear power project. It's been on hold for quite a few years now. And I think really my take on that is that whatever your views on the European Union and sovereignty and all the rest of it, there is no doubt that Brexit has been the most massive time and energy suck and a huge distraction for the government from having a sort of industrial policy, levelling up and all of that. And those two things, you know, the Horizon nuclear power project, and regardless of your views on nuclear power, and also Hitachi Rail, would have been huge things in terms of levelling up. There are thousands of people now working at the Newton Aycliffe plant assembling trains. If HS2 doesn't go ahead, although apparently the current indication is that it will in a sort of, well, we started so we'll finish kind of half-hearted way, you know, Hitachi have acquired a lot of rail companies in Italy. They may well think about moving their global headquarters out of the UK and into Italy if problems arise. So going on to wholesale then, lots of manufacturers have moved their European distribution hubs for reasons that David already mentioned. I reckon about 30 or so Japanese wholesale companies in the UK who had the UK as their distribution hub have just moved it, set up warehousing and so on in the Netherlands, etc. Many others already had huge sophisticated warehousing in the EU anyway, and this has had consequences in the past months for British consumers, specifically those who bought digital cameras online from Nikon or Canon have just been told that there will be severe delays and suspensions to deliveries, because apparently what's happened is UPS and DHL and people like that had the contract to ship those cameras directly from the warehouse in Rotterdam, whatever, to individual consumers in the UK, and they're just giving up at the moment because it's becoming so difficult to consolidate small individual orders. The paperwork's all wrong, or they're missing, or whatever, you know. So I'm sure Nikon and Canon have got the paperwork absolutely right, but you know, it's the other people that you'll kind of consolidate your load with that's going to cause the problems. So finance and insurance, which is of course the sector that the UK is particularly keen on, and of course there was nothing in the deal really to reassure on that, and it sounds like the EU is not going to be particularly keen on regulatory equivalence and so on. And there definitely has been disinvestment from Japanese companies in this sector, and correspondingly investment into the Netherlands, Germany and Luxembourg over the past few years. Plenty of the UK-based ones have set up subsidiaries, in other words, in those countries to make sure they can continue to passport in. The number of Japanese financial insurance companies in the UK fell by 1/3 over the past 7 years, according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. Although other statistics I've got say that it's remained static. And I think what's really going on is not so much, again, withdrawal, but consolidation. There's been a lot of tidying up going on, and also turning what were subsidiaries of in the UK into branches. Some smaller regional Japanese banks have left, indeed. And the numbers employed looks pretty static. So there hasn't been a real drift of UK-based employees over to the continent. However, I think there is going to be a lot of pressure from the EU to have significant presence and decision makers in the EU. So you might see perhaps, and you actually are seeing a little bit of a drift of Japanese expats to the Netherlands and Germany and so on. I think a lot of them are repositioning, already have positioned themselves as EMEA, Europe, Middle East and Africa headquarters rather than European headquarters. Nomura has immediately jumped on this idea that they can start trading Swiss shares again, which is a benefit of Brexit apparently. And I think the London, I'm hoping anyway, will still be a training ground for up and coming Japanese employees. You know, a huge number of expats that are here are sort of junior Japanese in the city. And there's still that very strong wish to collaborate, which was reinforced in the UK-Japan EPA, to learn from UK regulatory and governments in this sector and to collaborate between London and Tokyo. So I think that's going to continue. Now onto the sector that is the most concerned to me, and I think a lot of people on this call, which is services and what I would call regional headquarters. So notoriously, a couple of years ago, Panasonic and Sony shifted the legal domicile of their European organisation to the EU. This was partly not to do with Brexit, it's to do with Japanese tax haven laws. But I also think it was risk aversion. They didn't want to have to cope, and neither did I, with the triangulation of invoicing for something that you provide in the EU from the UK using somebody else in the EU. It was just, I think that whole area, they just thought, forget it. It's so much simpler if you're in a single market to do all of that. So they just shifted that administrative function over to the Netherlands or Germany. And I think many other Japanese companies that I've spotted have done that very similar things, and quite often their subsidiaries in the UK have turned into branches as a consequence. So this will be the cause of the substantial disinvestment that there has been from the UK services sector, particularly in 2018. Many of the regional headquarters continue de facto to be in the UK in terms of the people. So thank God, some of my customer contacts are still in the UK. But what they're doing is they're getting management service fees from Japan headquarters rather than making a profit, as it were. And this will have big tax implications for the UK, that this is just service fees now, so there won't be much to tax. And the regional headquarters are the main customers for me, and no doubt many of the other UK services sector companies, some of them may be represented on this call. And I think this accounts for the huge surplus in exports of services from the UK to Japan, is because we host so many of these regional coordinating companies. So long as they all stay here in terms of people, and who knows, as David said, what will happen in the long term without freedom of movement of people, then I think we're going to be okay. But one of the main drivers of demand for services from Japanese companies was mergers and acquisitions. And the number and scale of mergers and acquisitions in the UK from Japan has certainly dropped in the past few years. And the major Japanese acquisitions that have happened in the EU have been in the EU rather than the UK. For example, Mitsubishi Corporation acquiring the Dutch energy company Eneco. Now, fortunately, I had moved my EU business to my German partner about 3 years ago. And we already had a consultant based in the Netherlands. So we got that business, the post-merger integration training. And I still made money from a commission on the e-learning modules that I had developed a couple of years ago, which were all taken by the Interco people. So to go to the final sector then, digital and communications, it does look like the digital is indeed the future for my business, and it was supposed, of course, to be one of the new improved parts of the UK-Japan EPA as well. And the only big foreign direct investment inflow into the UK from Japan in recent years has been what the Japanese Ministry of Finance categorises as communications, which I assume, it's difficult to tell, but I assume this must be perhaps NTT basing its global headquarters in London and transferring assets and investing accordingly. Other Japanese telecommunications companies and ICT companies like NEC have also been acquiring a lot recently in the UK, outsourcing and IT companies and security companies and things like that. And they and others like Fujitsu have tried to stay positive about Brexit and also quietly demonstrate their 5G capabilities as an alternative to Huawei. And of course, I mean, I think definitely Fujitsu got their eye on customs technologies that we're going to be needing now, in other words. And coronavirus has also been an accelerator of digital transformation for Japanese companies, who of course represent a very large client base for them. So if you're looking for a bright spot, relatively untouched by the Brexit agreement one way or another, I would say digital communications would be where to look. And so long as the British government can refocus, the areas that Japanese companies are definitely interested in are green technology, including of course EVs, infrastructure and energy.
Great, thank you, Pernille. Good to finish on a bright spot.
I tried to.
Now we've got lots of questions coming in, and we've got half an hour for them. So let's whiz into some of them. I want to first of all, sort of, as it were, seal off in a way, in a very British way, Northern Ireland. Nicholas McCain is asking about Japanese companies. How many are foreign indirect investors in Northern Ireland versus the Irish Republic? And have they been adversely affected by the Brexit problem so far? If perhaps Pernille could offer an answer to that first, and then just ask David to say how you think the Northern Ireland issue is likely to be resolved, or if it's going to be resolved.
The easy bit. Yeah, so I have looked into this, and the only really big employer in Northern Ireland that's Japanese is a company called Ryobi Aluminium Casting, who make castings and so on for the automotive sector. And there hasn't been any news out of them recently. I know what they've done for Brexit is that they've acquired something else in the supply chain, which I think is going to help them with supply chain issues. They've certainly been prepared. They say they get their aluminium from the UK, so presumably that means that they, at least the supply chain issues, won't be coming at them directly. And so far, so good. I haven't heard of any problems out there. There is one other company that's only employs about 100 people or so that make plastic spray bottles. But again, it's quite niche, so I imagine they're going to be all right. In terms of Ireland, Republic of Ireland, the most big bit of FBI recently was Fifes, the banana people, were acquired by Sumitomo Corporation in 2016, so that's huge. Otherwise, Ireland has seems to have a very clear role in Japanese FDI minds, which is it is basically there for aviation financing and pharmaceuticals. And because, of course, it has a large US IT investment, there are some Japanese IT investments there as well. But it's largely, I think, seen as aviation and aviation capital and pharmaceuticals. How they're coping, I'm not sure. I have heard rumours that people like Astellas might be sort of looking at direct to the EU shipping routes and things like that.
Well, yes, I should think they are. No, I think the Takeda Shire acquisition also affected plants in in the Republic of Ireland quite a lot. David, the Northern Ireland issue writ large.
It almost, I was just checking that unreliable source of history, 1066 and all that, suggests that every time there was something called the Irish question in the 19th century, that every time the UK were close to settling it, the Irish changed the question. So this is just a reminder that relations between the UK and Ireland have been complex for a long time. The way I see it with the Northern Ireland Protocol is that it really is absolutely the worst solution, apart from all the other possible solutions, which are even worse. And therefore, the fact that yes, it does put in barriers. It puts goods barriers in place between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It puts barriers in place for services between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But there isn't a better alternative. The other alternatives would be that the UK as a whole would stay close to EU regulations, which the UK government shows no sign of wanting to do. Unification of Ireland, I don't think we are that close. A land border on the island of Ireland, which doesn't seem to be a good idea either. Or a smuggler's charter where there isn't a land border, but there's open borders into the single market. That also seems unacceptable. Therefore, I think that we are stuck with probably lots of politics around it, plenty of occasions on which the two sides will yell at each other, plenty of things going on that are uneasy, and occasional tweaks to it in order to sort of keep it moving. But I just can't see a better alternative, nor can I see it ever being desperately comfortable.
Thank you. No, I rather agree with you about the smugglers point. I mean, one of the issues with the Irish Sea border is I think the pressure, personally, being put on the border workers and border things from criminal groups is to try to make it a bit easier for smuggling, to be honest. In other words, just to soften the controls. But anyway, that's a cynical view. Another question that is going to go straight to you, David, really. Anna Jezewska, who's another trade specialist, has popped in a question. How quickly do you, David, think that the political process can be separated from the operational process, and the TCA, Trade and Cooperation Agreement committees, be used to try to find practical solutions to trade friction within the scope of the TCA? So, which is a way for the non-trade people to say, how is as it were, the sort of institutional system going to settle down?
Basically, how quickly can real customs experts, like indeed Anna, get down to work talking with each other and push the politicians out to one side? And unfortunately, I suspect it may be some time. Okay, there's a bigger question to which we're often asked: Will this agreement change? And I think we're in the habit of thinking UK-EU trade relations will change, will continue to be in flux, because the EU membership's rather like that. There's always regulations coming in and going out. Free trade agreements, by contrast, are pretty static, so I don't expect quick change. In terms of the detail, I think that once the UK government stops making this entirely about politics and getting lots of headlines about how tough they're being with the EU, and just settles down to having a decent EU team which listens to business and starts wanting to make things happen, then that's when it will start happening. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening at the moment. There isn't even we don't even know where the team that would do that is located. There isn't an obvious team that would do that. The argument over whether the EU ambassador should be a full ambassador in London or not is indicative, because you want that person to be a full ambassador if you are serious about having a better relationship. Similarly, the original idea of having an EU office in Northern Ireland, you would actually want an EU office in Northern Ireland if you were really concerned about dealing with the detail. The fact that the government has not done those things suggests to me that it's not ready yet to get into that detailed conversation with the EU, which in any case is not necessarily always the quickest body to operate. Therefore, I'm afraid to say I think it will take some time before even some of the more obvious easements can be put in place between the UK and the EU. That's my fear. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm feeling a little bit pessimistic at the moment on that one.
Thank you. And I'll follow straight away before moving to some Japanese questions for Pernille, but I'm following straight away to one for you again, David, from Andrew Fraser, works for Mitsubishi Corporation, who's asked about government intervention, the state aids regime, essentially. I mean, he says, post-COVID, we hope that there is a post-COVID, there is inevitably going to be much greater government intervention in economies in the UK and across the EU. How will this impact the assessment of breaches of the UK-EU agreement, which I think...
I think that's a very big question, and I think it's a very big question for the future of developed economies globally, because it seems to me that state aid is coming back into global fashion anyway. It never fully went out, but it seems to me it's coming back into global fashion, that countries want to be able to now intervene. They want to give money. They feel that they fail now that global value chains have put companies too much in the driving seat as to where they locate operations, and where they locate them is not necessarily where governments would want them to locate, and that possibly the only way to do something about that is to give them money, and then the money, but that can fall foul of varying rules and WTO, in trade and cooperation agreement, in many free trade agreements. I think this is a coming problem for all trade agreements. I suspect generally EU trade agreements, well, anybody's trade agreements, they don't use all these dispute settlement provisions. They have long-winded dispute settlement provisions, but ultimately it's all discussed behind closed doors in the form of the officials working on both sides working out some fair way between them. That kind of comes back to the last question: how quickly can we do that? But it is much more in the UK's interest to basically set up those channels, because the EU will be subsidising like mad, as will the UK, and I don't think either of us will be doing it much significantly differently to the other. So it's probably better handled not in the dispute settlement provisions. But again, is one confident of that? Not completely sure, but definitely a big issue to look at. But in general, I don't think that. I think there will be ways, even given the trade agreement, there will be ways of governments finding ways to provide state subsidies. So I suspect it'll be resolved behind the scenes rather than going to disputes.
Interesting. No, that sounds very plausible. Pernille, now I'm going to direct you. I'll ask also David afterwards. Hugh Trenchard has asked a question about life sciences. He says, I would like to ask Mr. Henig and Ms. Rudlin if they agree that, as the chairman of a Japanese life sciences company told me recently, Brexit provides the opportunity for the UK to return to a UK-style common law-based, principles-based regulatory policy, and indeed leave the European Medicines Agency, which would ensure that the UK looks the best place in the world for a global life sciences company like ours, I mean, like the Japanese company he was talking to research, innovate, develop, license, and manufacture new products and medicines. How does from a Japanese corporate point of view, how does the UK look in terms of life sciences and the regulatory environment? Is that particularly attractive or not, do you think, Pernille?
Well, presumably, ultimately, you still want to sell into Europe. So you'll still have to go and get your approval from the European Medicines Agency, or whatever it's called. And certainly the major R&D and pharmaceutical manufacturing company that's Japanese in the UK is Eisai. And they employ several hundred people here. There's no signs that they're going to move or anything like that, but they have certainly transferred all of their marketing and authorization to the European Union, and they've also transferred warehousing and testing to the European Union as well. So yeah, sure, we've got lots of, it comes to people again, doesn't it? We've got lots of very good people here who want to do research. But in the end, presumably you still want to sell to the European Union.
Yes, I think the question was about as a research innovation development centre, and Takeda is pretty big in the UK now.
Not as big as it was. That's certainly one of the companies that's been moving out.
Thanks to the Shire acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, I think they seem to be focusing much more on Switzerland now.
I think it's very difficult to stand outside of the EU's regulatory reach, or indeed global regulatory reach. I just think that's the way global trade is set up, around a lot of overlap in regulation and a lot of overlap in terms of the way inspections are carried out, so that whereas there may be some individual opportunities, I don't think, in general, it won't provide the UK with a huge opportunity. But in specific cases where there are specific things that can be done, then there are possibilities. So I would put it like that. It's not a general opportunity, but I can't speak for individual businesses whether there might be an opportunity if certain rules were set in different ways to do some things in different ways. Yes, probably.
Right, but as Pernille says, since you're wanting to trade across borders, it's other people's regulations that really affect you as well. Let me move on perhaps briskly to the TPP, just to, there's been quite a number of questions. You mentioned the CPTPP, David, but a number of people have followed up on it. Tony Manning, what's the benefit for the members of CPTPP for the UK joining? Does it appear to be more of being seen to be doing deals? Others have said, what's the justification for a European country to join this specific partnership? How do you see this TPP question for the UK?
So I see it in two ways. That from an economic point of view, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. These are faraway countries. We're not going to be integrated particularly strongly into their supply chains. But from a political point of view, and not political headlines, but from a political point of view of which countries would the UK choose to work with on trade, it makes a lot of sense. So, I think that if you take the world of trade to be, there's three major countries or blocks who are dominating: China, the US, and the EU. The next group who really want to make sure the system keeps going and keeps running, keeps open, is going to include Japan, the UK, Canada, Australia, Singapore. Well, you've got there members of the CPTPP. So if this helps the UK to be part of a kind of a new club, and this is the view of a number of kind of what I would call trade veterans who even work within the government, there are some, that if it's part of a new club, and I think I've even heard this also from people in Japan, officials in Japan, seeing the UK as part of a new club, okay, that sounds good. It anchors the UK in a way. So I see it as less about economics, more about politics. There may yet be some problems with some of the provisions, but as I say, it does make sense. And I think in general, it makes sense at a policy level, the UK and Japan and some of the other countries to try to work more closely with each other. I was in a separate engagement recently where I was thinking, compared to a number of other countries, UK-Japan policy relations have actually been quite weak. It's been a quiet relationship, a business-led relationship, and perhaps it needs to now advance a little bit more into some of the big policy issues like trade.
Well, I'll follow that by reading out a comment that's in here from our friend Tomohiko Taniguchi, who's spoken previously at Japan Society webinars, former close advisor to Prime Minister Abe. He says his comment, he's written in, former Japanese ambassador to the UK, Tsuruoka, was, before assuming the ambassadorship, Government of Japan's chief negotiator for TPP. He is articulate all the time that Britain could and should join TPP, which he can testify, Taniguchi-san, is a view Shinzo Abe also holds from a geostrategic point of view, exactly the point you've made, essentially, David. Now, a question for Pernille from, no, I've lost it. Trouble, these things move up and down. Maria McManus has asked a question, which I'll direct at you, Pernille. How is Japanese business viewing possible divergence of standards, of UK standards, from EU standards? How high does this loom, Pernille, in the thinking of the Japanese businesses you work with?
Well, the best place to find out the answer to this one is JETRO's surveys, which is the Japan External Trade Organization, and they survey their members regularly. And as far as I can recollect, I could try and find it right now, that might be a distraction. Actually, that did feature quite highly, that there would be any divergence. They really don't want there to be much divergence because it's just a pain. You're not going to start two production lines, are you? One that's for the EU and one that's for the UK. So you'd rather have one that kind of fits all, as it were. So yeah, I think that their view very much is please don't diverge too much. It's really not helpful. Yeah.
And Paul Farrelly has asked, how important will language be in retaining a Japanese presence in the UK, even when some operations shift to the European mainland, given, because the investment in learning English, as opposed to the prospect of mastering banking German in rather unattractive Frankfurt, for instance. Now, I live in Ireland. They do speak a form of English, so we can come here. But nevertheless, how do you see that, Pernille?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and one that's been on my mind a bit as well. And I think, to be honest, I think it's losing its edge as an attraction in the UK, because I think what James Cummins has discovered is that actually the Dutch speak English really well. Even the French are speaking English a lot more than they would dream of doing in a few years ago. And I think the Netherlands is definitely the winner on this one, if you look at where FDI and where Japanese people are going. But the fact is, it's still a very small country, and Amsterdam is still pretty small too. So there's been some very strange data coming out about Japanese nationals in the UK. It went down by about 5,000 over the past couple of years. Now it's suddenly let back up again. And I think a lot of that has got to do with students coming to the UK. And I think this is still very important. We need to really consider the university sector as well in this. And the point is that Japanese students prefer short courses, 3 months, 6 months, that kind of thing. And I think the data has gone weird because the Japanese government and maybe the UK government as well keep switching whether that's a long-term residential visa or not. So I think that's distorting the figures slightly. And certainly also I think a lot of Japanese are thinking, you know, if I want to learn English, I could go somewhere cheaper and nearer, even to sort of Asian countries. They might go to Malaysia or something like that to learn English. So we can't be too smug, I think, about us being the English-speaking nation. But I think, yeah, it's still important. But I think it's because of London itself being such a great place to be, or at least it was anyway. And I think where I see things going, I hope, is not so much English language teaching, but learning about professions, whether that's financial or HR or marketing, you know, those sorts of professional qualifications. I think that's going to become much more important in Japan. People are moving away from being generalists now. And the UK has got a long tradition of training people in professions. And I think we should perhaps try and make that more appealing to Japanese students and trainees too. A lot of trainees for Japanese companies come to primarily London for 2 or 3 years. So I think we should be looking at providing services to them. Interesting idea, interesting thought.
Now, David Jennison has asked about the interplay between the Japan-UK free trade agreement and the Japan-EU free trade agreement, and now the UK-EU one. Now he says, we hear that duties are being charged on Japanese goods arriving in the UK and being exported to the EU. Is this correct? I assume that it is. This is the rules of origin issue, but why don't you just talk through how those are, as it were, combining with one another?
Okay, well, so the answer is yes. There are the agreements that link EU, Japan, and UK. The network of bilaterals, and there is the opportunity under those agreements to link them up for rules of origin purposes, which means that you could seamlessly, almost, you could incorporate Japanese inputs into UK, and they would qualify for zero tariffs to the EU, or UK and EU to Japan. You see what I mean? You can combine them and they still get zero tariffs. Unfortunately, the UK and Japan are quite keen on that. The EU is not. So the EU is not playing ball on that one and does not want to, as is known, accumulate the origin to allow a sort of a zero tariff area between UK, EU, and Japan. So at the moment, that is not happening. There is a very, I'm just going to link it in. I'm just going to sort of take a privilege of a speaker to link it into a very good question that is in the list from Paul Diamond, who asks about competitiveness generally about in the UK, because I think this is a terrific question. Will the UK be more or less competitive given what is happening? And the chances are that in some of these manufacturing areas, particularly sort of in general manufacturing, general engineering, we're going to be less competitive. Whereas we were already, as has been called by one UK trade expert, frighteningly competitive in services. So it's very interesting that we're, Pernille and I are both sort of picking up on this sort of IT digital services, remotely provided services, that, you know, which are less affected by trade deals. So it may well be that in some areas we do lose an element of competitiveness. Not being able to bring in European staff into the UK may be an element of loss of competitiveness as well, but that is not going to be the full story. So it's going to differ sector by sector.
Interesting, yes. And let me just ask, perhaps Pernille, it's an extension really of what you've been saying, but a couple of people have asked about London and its attraction. How crucial London is to, as it were, the UK's attraction for Japanese companies specifically, as it were, competitiveness as a location. Do you see London with it, as it were, for entrepreneurs, for starting up businesses, for attracting people, maintaining its position? Actually, Roger Gifford has mentioned diversity, the liking of coming to London because you come to the world, you come to the whole world here. How do you see, and of course you're living in Norwich, so maybe it's an unfair question, but nevertheless, how do you see the appeal of London for Japanese business?
Yeah, I think it's never going to go away. I mean, you know, it's partly it's almost a historical, sentimental thing. You know, that particularly if you look at people like my former employers, the trading companies, you know, they're not going anywhere. They're going to stay. And trading companies are extremely important in not just traditional areas, but, you know, a lot of them, particularly Itochu, have been investing in startups here in the UK, in what Japanese call, I don't know if it's commonly used elsewhere, but they call it CASE, connected, autonomous, sharing and electric. So it's not specifically electric vehicles, although that's part of it. It means the whole infrastructure. You know, so one of the most bizarre, it would seem on the surface, investments recently has been a Japanese company called Park 24 acquiring national car parks. Now you might think, what on earth do they want a whole bunch of multi-storey car parks for? But it's actually the whole part of this idea about, well, you're going to have to charge cars. So wouldn't it be good to have the car park where you have the charging things, car sharing, all of those things could be operated out of a car park. So there's a whole thought going on there. So I think that area is interesting. I was just actually doing some more research on finance this morning because we keep going fintech. And I think an awful lot of people, including me, don't really understand what that means. There hasn't been an awful lot of investment into London for that area, and what it has been pretty like one or two people turning up to sort of get a sense of what's going on here. But I actually discovered that Estonia suddenly had 12 more Japanese financial services companies pitch in. So clearly, you know, I mean, Estonia has been trying to grab that piece of the pie for quite a while now, and obviously it's had some success. And I think generally, I do, one counter to the attractions of London and the UK as being a bigger economy, I've also heard from some Japanese companies, they quite like starting new businesses in smaller European economies. It's less of a risk, it's less embarrassing if it goes wrong. And you do see a slight uptick in both Eastern European smaller economies and places like Portugal and Ireland as being just a nice place to incubate something just to see if it works. So I think we can't be, again, let's not be too smug about London's attractions. Yeah, we've got to work at it.
Thank you. Now we've only got a couple of minutes to go, so I'm going to ask both of you to put on your prediction hats, pick out your crystal balls. Now, David, you said that unfortunately everything was rather predictable. You hadn't been very surprised by what's happened, and I can understand that absolutely. You've been communicating about it very vigorously for the past 4 years, and nothing that's happened has surprised you. But let me make you look forward, perhaps 1 year. Do you think that anything's going to change in that year? I mean, what would you predict that will change? How will things look different in 1 year's time from the point of view of the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement? And I'll ask the comparable question to Pernille.
Well, I think that as compared to now, when all the stories are really about loss, within a year's time, you may find some of the people who are starting to see the opportunities. Now, it won't outweigh the people who found losses, but the adjustment will be, I would say, well underway. And it's important to recognise that whereas some industries have quite a long investment lead time, automotive is classic for this. Others, it's much shorter. And clearly, we're looking at electric vehicles as well, or we're waiting on the investments in that to come in. But yeah, I think the one thing to look out for is what are the signs that, as well as the people losing out, that there's some people setting up in the UK or setting up maybe in Northern Ireland, of finding the opportunities, because they will be there. It's never always just one way.
Very good. Pernille, anything brisk to predict in your sort of sense of what Japanese companies will be thinking for a year's time?
Well, I think the obvious thing is that it kind of depends how the whole coronavirus thing works out as well. And for them, for the UK particularly, it also depends on what the impact of both the coronavirus and Brexit is on the UK economy. I think that if I cast my mind back to that JETRO survey I mentioned, I think that probably came number one amongst Japanese companies in the UK's concerns, apart from Brexit itself, was what would the British economy be like over the next year or so. So given all of that, it's a bit hard to make a prediction, but say, ideally, it turns out that we do manage to get back to some kind of coronavirus-free-ish world, and we can sort of, as I said, let's hope in a way that the Brexit is less of a distraction to the government now, and they really can pay attention to their green technology levelling up agenda. Chinese companies are definitely there and waiting on green technology, on 5G, on infrastructure. I think what's never going to go away, I hope, is that I think Japan, partly for the geopolitical reasons that David mentioned, and you saw today in the headlines for the UK or Japanese news, as it were, there's a lot of military manoeuvres now going on between Japan and the UK and the Pacific. So this is clearly an area where we have strategic interests together. So that's not going to go away. They really would like to work with the UK, perhaps just politely draw a veil over the slightly embarrassing things that have happened over the past few years and move on. And so I'd love to see that happening by the end of this year. But it does depend a bit on what happens with coronavirus, I think.
Very good. Personally, I've always had a belief that there should be a political slogan with the favourite three-word formula these days of "Make Brexit boring." We should not be so distracted by it all, and if only it would become boring rather than an important thing in all our lives. But anyway, I want to thank Pernille Rudlin and David Henig very warmly for a terrific discussion covering such a wide range of issues. Thank everyone who joined the call. We had a record, or almost record attendance, more than 200 people on the call. Nearly 300 had originally signed up. Many of those who couldn't turn up and watch, or will, I hope, watch the video on YouTube when we put it up there. So a terrific amount of interest in this topic, and I'm sure there will continue to be. So thank you very much, David Henig and Pernille Rudlin, and thank you to all Japan Society members and supporters for joining the call. Thank you very much.